Marshall here. Welcome back to the Realignment. Hey everyone, welcome back to the show. Today's guest is Heritage Foundation President, Dr. Kevin Roberts. Kevin has a new book out, Dawn's Early Light, Taking Back Washington to Save America. Folks have probably heard of Kevin and the Heritage Foundation because they were the authors of Project 2025, an incredibly controversial manifesto and plan for a second Trump administration that really took off during the summer when Democrats put it at the center of their attacks on an incoming Trump administration. Now, I've been really interested lately in this question of mandates and what actual mandate Trump has after his victory this past November. So Kevin and I discussed mandates, the Heritage Foundation's perspective on what Trump should actually do, and this broader conversation around history and our current moment. Hope you all enjoy it. And of course, a huge thank you to the Foundation for American Innovation for supporting the work of this podcast. Dr. Kevin Roberts, welcome to the Realignment.
Marshall, I've really been looking forward to this. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to chatting with you. I would love to just start out with the very, very obvious question. I want to phrase this very specifically. A lot of think tanks exist. I work at multiple think tanks. A lot of think tanks put out reports on agendas, ideas. At a minimum, I think you could agree with the fact that Project 2025, as part of Heritage's Mandate for Leadership series, had a narrative impact on the election. Obviously, President Trump won the election, so we're not making this claim in the negative. But I would just be curious to ask you the meta. Why do you think Heritage's work resonated in a way that, let's say, it's not as if like Cato's 2020 plan became talked about at all? I'd love you to just like talk about like that side of this issue.
Yeah, excellent question. And I don't say the following with any hubris, if anything, hopefully quite the opposite. And that's some institutional humility. We know what time it is in America, which is a way of saying that we have a sense of urgency at Heritage, which sometimes surprises people because, as you know, we've been around for more than 50 years. We're considered a legacy institution on the right. And to a large extent, that's correct, at least in the best sense of that term. But the thing about Heritage today is that makes it distinctive, if not unique in DC, is the same thing that's made it unique for that 51 years or that 51-year period, and that is how we're funded. So unlike most DC headquartered groups who are funded by perfectly good people, but people who, might be looking for particular research ends, we are supported by several 100,000 Americans. In other words, we're in the city, but not of the city. And what that means is our research, which is, of course, is driven by our policy scholars' diagnosis of problems and solutions, better reflects what ordinary Americans are feeling. All of that to lead to this punchline to your question, Marshall. When we put together Project 2025, we didn't want it to be a typical Washington think tank set of policies and personnel recommendations. We wanted it to reflect what the American people were thinking, and therefore we invited literally every conservative center-right organization in this country that does federal policy work into it, and 110 organizations joined. That's what made it such a target. So it was those two things. Number one, kind of the way Heritage operates, which is to reflect the everyday American. But secondly, the sheer scope of this, I think, really put the left on notice, which, by the way, we wanted to do. I will confide in you, and obviously your very large audience, so basically the whole world, that we did not anticipate the left would make it such a target. And some weeks of that were a little unpleasant for us because it was difficult to match the amount of money they were spending in the mischaracterization. But looking back, I actually think it helped generate turnout for the good guys.
Here's something I'm curious about. I will modify a statement you made and just tell you like reflexively what I was. You're characterizing the left making this an issue. But I think if we're looking at the 2024 election, I talked to plenty of like people on the center left. What they would basically say is like, look, most of what we talked about didn't really break through on a couple of different levels. And I will tell you that, and not just in Austin, Texas, but in general, I did hear more about Project 2025 from a normie perspective, just from an everyday, hey, I'm a millennial Gen Z person who's like looking at things. What lesson has that potential gap between your diagnosis of DC and just the fact that we're in this weird election where Trump is just so big that it could basically paper over a bunch of different vulnerabilities? What lessons have you taken from that part?
Well, we're always doing what we call post-mortems, typical in the for-profit world. And I think that's another thing that makes us distinctive. And we're early in the process of the post-mortem on the election for us and what we did well and could do better. And one of the things I know that we could do better, even though we attempted to do a lot of this, is to reach, as you say, the normies. In other words, people who, as probably our mutual friend Mark Andreessen says, are part of this pincer movement, tech elites, plus those of us who are sort of populist conservatives, that we've got the opportunity, as you talk about often on your podcast, to lead this realignment. We were very intentional about wanting to reach them with messaging that was outside of Project 2025. But the big tactical error that we made in the first 6 weeks of the left mischaracterizing this, and I'm open about that because we're always trying to be better, was that we didn't respond to them in kind. And rather than just be focused on fact checking the left, which we did an exceptional job of, we ought to have changed our messaging sooner in being focused on the normies. And the silver lining to this is we learned about halfway through the campaign that all of you were on our side, even if you had differences of opinion on some of the policy, because you thought the mischaracterization was absurd and contributed to the distrust that you have in legacy outlets. Now we understand at Heritage that needs to be on the front end of what we talk about.
Something I'm fascinated by, I just recorded an episode with my good friend Raihan Salam. So he's president of the Manhattan Institute. Yeah, we're basically doing a good survey of conservative think tank leadership here this month. And we had a long discussion about mandates, like the idea of a mandate. Now, if we look at the past 4 presidencies, there's been a pretty straightforward history of misinterpreting mandates and then that leading to political disaster. So you see George W. Bush wins re-election in 2004. Very quickly, aside from the Iraq War, which is sort of baked into the cake there, you see we're going to privatize Social Security. You sort of see all these attempts that create the ownership society that didn't actually resonate with the fact that George W. Bush won re-election because he was seen as the security president. And there wasn't that same mandate. Look at President Obama. The 2008 financial crisis happens. People see that as a bigger potential area of focus instead of Obamacare. That leads to problems. Obama wins in 2012. America's fine. Actually, turns out America isn't fine. Trump is elected. I think he brings a lot of chaos from the 2016 campaign into government. And very quickly in 2018, a lot of voters don't like that. And finally, Joe Biden comes in under a COVID normalcy campaign and then very quickly sees, I think, delusions of FDR, and then I think overreaches from that perspective as well, too. So given that lengthy, but I think important history to note for listeners, how do you see the warning signs that presents both for President Trump with his second term, and then frankly, something for the Heritage Foundation, which is saying, hey, there's this mandate. I would just say most people get mandates wrong. How do you think about actually assessing the balance between here's what we want and here's what the voters are actually saying in not quite always coherent ways?
Yeah, man, I love that lead in. So this might sound ironic coming from the leader of the organization that since 1980 has published every 4 years something called Mandate for Leadership. But the American historian in me would just have to agree with you emphatically that only very rarely in our history have presidents had what I would consider a real mandate. Most of the time, I would say 80 or 90% of the time, political leaders across our ideological spectrum say that there is a mandate that doesn't really exist. In this case,
and I'll push the historian of you. What's the 10? I'm curious. What's the 10%? Like, when have there been some historical mandates that actually existed in your thinking?
The two that quickly come to mind, and there are others, but these are the two that come to mind for what it's worth. 1864, Abraham Lincoln's reelection, which was, as you know, it was not a sure thing up until September when Sherman was able to drive to the Atlantic Ocean, and obviously. Lincoln was able to dispatch his former General McClellan. But then that became a mandate both to end the war, but also to put a real firm chokehold on the enslavement of 4 million Americans. But then the second one is 1932 and 36 with FDR. And I might even argue 1940. But, what's instructive about the FDR case, which is a nice segue into what I was thinking about saying, is that even FDR overreached on the mandate. There was a mandate to ameliorate economic conditions, basically to bring the country back to an economic stability. He took that maybe I should say, more accurately, some of his advisors took that. So the parallels to Biden are really strong as a mandate for, not pejoratively, a more socialist managed economy. Mm-hmm. And the American electorate ended up rejecting that. It took a couple of cycles, but had FDR lived, which of course would have been wonderful from a human standpoint, in 1948 he wouldn't have been able to run because the political capital for that had been used. All of that to say, is there a mandate now? There is a mandate now, actually. I think 2024 is going to be one of those elections, but to the heart of your underlying assumption, the mandate is the following. It's to return this country back to normal. And back to normal means that, there are normal grocery prices, gas prices, things that are very important, but normal almost in a mood, and something that's very hard to measure. What I don't think there is necessarily a mandate for, although there can be one generated after the election, given the great communication ability of President Trump, is the level of dismantling of the administrative state that Heritage has proposed. And therein lies the irony of my saying that. We have never shied away at Heritage of arguing for the aspirational. And it is truly aspirational for us, for example, to be arguing for the utter elimination of the U.S. Department of Education. We've been called kooky. We've been called crazy. We've been called worse in this election cycle for saying that. But after 45 years of saying it, it's a real possibility. Whether or not there is a mandate for that, whether or not there is a mandate for Elon and Vivek to do on the scale of what they're planning to do, time will tell. The possibility is there, but I think this is the really important postscript on this assessment for what it's worth, Marshall. And that is mandates exist only to the extent that the politician trying to sell it closes the deal. And that's why in the last 8 days, we're recording this 8 or 9 days after the election, I've been talking about the importance of President Trump, Vice President Vance, all of their cabinet appointees, not just assuming confirmation and that the American people are going to say, we agree with 100% of what you want to do. They constantly have to be on message. Thus far they are, but it's very early.
I want to talk about the normalcy frame, because I think it's a very good one, and ask you about, I think, a policy area that gets at the tension we're talking about directly here, which is tariff policy. So I just want to say outright, most of my work is in the foreign policy category. So I will just say, I'm incredibly friendly and supportive of tariff policy, especially as relates to China specifically, but something President Trump has spoken about and something you've been interviewed about plenty of time and very frank around is your support for tariffs broadly as a industrial strategy or an economic strategy for the United States. There is a bit of a contradiction between the idea that we're going down to normal prices and the obvious costs that would come to consumers when it actually comes to enacting broad-based tariffs. Talk about that, because I think that's the perfect example of if we just surveyed, and look, I have plenty of friends who were on the bubble, but actually went towards Trump for a variety of levels. And I will say they would focus on the inflation story. They'd focus on Democrats being out of step with cultural milieus. They're very much in that Joe Rogan audience that was up for grabs. So they would definitely not agree with the fact that they thought tariffs were on the table when it came to the set of policies prescriptions. So talk about the balance. And once again, I get the political policy case for the tariff policy, but there's a bit of a contradiction here. So I'd like for you to talk about that.
Yeah, that's a 100% fair assessment. In fact, beyond that, I would say that I agree with what you just said. So let me speak to the general, and then I'll speak to the specific. It's probably the most succinct way the slow talking Southerner can answer the question. The first is in the general. Look, Heritage, to be clear, 100% supports tariffs on the Chinese Communist Party, and I will say, without any hubris, I think we've led the movements, the conservative movements, reconsideration of that position, and I'm proud of my colleagues' work on that. And I would expect that to happen. That will have an effect on prices. That will prevent the otherwise good work that or productive work that the administration will be doing to reduce prices. Let me move on to that second point and say this. I think that what the Trump administration will do in deregulation and other fiscal policy is going to, at least their target will be a 4% annual growth rate. And I think that they're going to hit it in 2025. If that happens, and now leading to the real specific point, then I think we get to have a national conversation about our tax regime. Now, our official policy at the Heritage Foundation is that outside of China and a few other examples, our default is going to be somewhat skeptical of tariffs for a reason that may not be particularly obvious. It isn't just, or I should say, it isn't that philosophically we're saying it's an impossibility. What we're saying is, unless you get rid of the existing tax regime and the favoritism regime, which picks winners and losers, if all you're doing is putting a 10% global tariff on top of that regime, it actually makes no sense and actually will create the kind of inflation that you're talking about. If, however, going back to your question about mandate and the willingness of the president and vice president to really sell this to the American people, and you're wanting to change the entire tax regime and really start controlling government spending, which we're going to have to do whether we want to or not, then tariffs make a heck of a lot of sense. And you could see Heritage being very supportive of that. But that is like the tallest of orders in a list of tall orders. I think that's perhaps even more difficult than eliminating the Department of Education, even though these are very good ideas that we should be working on.
So something I'm curious about, I'd love you to talk broadly about, and not just from a concern, because once again, I think what's important about this show is we have a very broad-based audience. So there are a bunch of people on the right who hear you say eliminate the Department of Education, and they're nodding along because this is the received canon. To your point, this has been a almost 50-year project on the right. Why does that matter in the long term? Because I think my concern about the Department of Education elimination, because obviously there are plenty of functions of the department that would be distributed to like other departments that would move about. It's not purely just eliminationist. But let's say Democrats come back in 2028 or 2032, it's going to be like the Mexico City policy with abortion. Democrats are just going to reconstitute the Department of Education itself. So I think what would really matter for conservatives from a like outcomes perspective to make clear that there's a philosophical argument that's being won here, right? Like think of why FDR is a monumental president. When Eisenhower comes in after Republicans have been out in the cold for 20 years, what really solidifies FDR is he wins the argument over Social Security. He wins the argument over us transitioning from the 19th century capitalistic state to the mixed economy that emerges from World War II. How could conservatives actually win the argument over the Department of Education? Because I just am totally uninterested in a world where we spend the 2030s and the 2040s. We're eliminating it. No, we're creating it again and going back and back and back and forth.
Your skepticism is well-founded and shows your excellent reading of political history. The bottom line up front is that we need to eliminate the Department of Education because doing so will improve education in this country. Eliminating the Department of Education will eliminate the following problem, that since the year 2000, something like 75 cents of every dollar we spend on education goes to non-instructional costs. That is fueled by this ridiculous process by which we tax people at the local level. And to give the very short version of a very long story you know well, it goes to DC and is redistributed through the most inefficient, ineffective system that I'm aware of in the world. That's not hyperbole. And I should say is coming from a fifth generation teacher who's only attended public schools. Let me hang on that point for just a moment and say public schools, I think, of all of the noble promises we make in this noble republic, happen to be the most noble, because we're saying in our pluralistic society that we want to guarantee equal opportunity to the finest education in the history of the world. The U.S. Department of Education not only is not doing that, it's undermining that goal. And in fact, we're winning the philosophical argument, aided and abetted by the nonsensical, ridiculous, unjust COVID lockdowns that caused tens of millions of apolitical parents to say, this is crazy what's going on in my local district. But the part of the sale that we still have to close, Marshall, to your question, is that too many Americans who are with us philosophically on there being a problem in educational attainment have not fully connected, because we haven't closed the sale. It's not because they're dumb. They've not fully connected that what they're seeing as problems in their local districts actually are fueled by what the U.S. Department of Education is doing. That's the kind of thing that's got to be done. And to your point about the yo-yo, while I agree with you, I don't want to live through that. I would rather live through that than that not happening at all, because we've now succeeded just in the last 5 years. Heritage has been working on this for 45 years, just in the last 5 years, at bringing this conversation into the mainstream. To finish up here, the more we focus on this benefiting students, the more we focus on this benefiting well-intentioned, well-formed teachers and of course, benefiting families and local communities, I think the greater likelihood we have of winning that philosophical argument.
Something I'm really curious about then to learn more about is we're kind of looking at different styles of approaches over the 21st century when it comes to education reform. So let's take two examples. So now No Child Left Behind during the George W. Bush administration, and then Race to the Top, Common Core, et cetera, during the Obama administration. I know you have thoughts on Common Core. I'm sure it's a very 2010s thing we've left behind, but like, let's just focus on like the theory behind both of these. One center right to weird center, and then another center left to center. Both approaches are reformist. The idea is, look, like we have this problem in American education. The federal government may have different problems, but like this is really this tool. And this is why this is an attractive feature. And this is partly why I think efforts to get rid of the department end up getting stymied when it comes to even Republican administrations. Because at the end of the day, we have these huge fights over schooling. We have a huge problem of education in this country. Having the Department of Education able to put its thumb on the scale of, let's say, increasing standards in the 2000s, which was all about what No Child Left Behind was, and then Race to the Top, which is, hey, like, and this is where there's a weird shift in the education reform debate. What really mattered about Race to the Top was there was a center-left school reform movement in the Democratic Party at the time. And they were basically saying, like, look, we're admitting somewhat publicly that you do have these outmoded public school systems, often in blue urban regions. We're going to use the money we have to try to push them. That breaks down for a variety of reasons that are beyond just like the lack of success on the actual program. But I guess what I'm basically saying to you is, like, why should Republicans reject the idea that we can use this department? And also this could apply to a bunch of other different categories as well too, right? Like I could see a very Trumpy use of the Department of Education. Hey, schools that use, let's say, onerous policies when it comes to free speech, schools that do X, Y, and Z will have their funding taken away, basically. So make the case against using the department as a article or a tool of reform versus getting rid of it. I'd be really interested in hearing your thoughts on that.
Two things. I probably have more than two things to say, but I'll start with two because your question, and I appreciate the follow-up because it's really central. The first is not philosophical, but really more data-driven. Since 1979, when the Department of Education was created, educational attainment for literally every demographic group in this country, however you define it, however you parse demographic groups, has declined. Every single one. Now, correlation is not causation. And so I would be the first to say that. I work with some statisticians. But if you look at the data, it is overwhelmingly obvious that since the creation of the U.S. Department of Education, education in this country has gotten worse. So it leads you to the philosophical question, at the very least, if you're not convinced by that, to the philosophical question you've posed, which is, why would that be? Because of the principle of subsidiarity. The principle of subsidiarity is a very powerful, longstanding principle in the Western tradition, which says that the unit of government, if you will, really the unit of organization, whether it's the family or the federal government, that's closest to a problem is best equipped to handle it. What we have learned, and here's my philosophical claim, is that even with the best of intentions, I'll even be really charitable and say we had the best of intentions in creating the department. I don't think that's necessarily the case, but I'll just posit it. Even with the best of intentions with the two reform movements you mentioned, which I do believe were well-intentioned. In hindsight, they were very poor in effect, but they were well-intentioned. Even with those best of intentions, we've learned that there should not be a federal Department of Education because it doesn't do the job. Parents are the primary educators of their kids, and the next best educators of kids are people in the local community. And what we're learning is you can't deliver on education at a local level, which happens just by definition, and fund it and run it from Washington, D.C. I think that's the kind of case that not just conservatives, but there's an increasing number of thoughtful people on the center left who are saying that they may prefer that the department exist, but they at least are willing to claim, and they're right, that there's something wrong with the structure that we need to modify. So let me just say, what if, as a result of all of these things, what we do is dramatically overhaul and reform the Department of Education rather than eliminate it? Heritage will still want it to be eliminated, but will that be really important success? A mere moderate reform of the department? Of course it will, and we will applaud that.
Here's something, just two more questions on education, because we have lots of things to cover here, but I appreciate you indulging the interest here. I would think that if I were to be hired by a sort of left of center left firm and be tasked with like articulating the case for why the Department of Education really matters, I would probably focus on Title I funding. So just, hey, like there are poor states and the federal government gives poor states more money especially from like coastal regions that are succeeding in the modern economy to help pay for their schooling. That's like the strong federal case. That's basically a very straightforward case for the department and the federal role. I would love for you just to articulate like what you think then the federal government's relationship to education will be. Let's say you get your wish moving forward. What would the federal, because it's easy to say subsidiarity. I think it's harder to look at, let's say, your most rural underfunded part of, no offense, Mississippi, Alabama, et cetera, and say, okay, this is now a local thing that's going to be dealt with. How would you articulate the federal role in those situations where, once again, you're seeing the strongest defenses of the status quo coming from?
Sure. Fair question. Whatever the parts of the U.S. Department of Education are that we believe as a polity need to exist, whether it be Title I, some other even more explicitly civil rights programs, we have a plan at Heritage and in Project 2025 that moves those into relevant departments. And so the U.S. Department of Treasury isn't going anywhere, nor should it. And so anything that has to do with funding, with and I don't mean this pejoratively, but the redistribution of funds, let Treasury handle it. Anything that has to do with the very serious, legitimate concern we ought to have, the examples you mentioned about poor communities, that can be handled in other departments. Now, I'm not a huge fan of everything that the Housing and Urban Development Department does or Health and Human Services, but I do believe that they should exist, and there might be a way of reforming that and including those programs in there. And I might even make a case that it's even more efficient to do so. But the larger question about the federal government's role in education, I think, is indirect. I think that perhaps the best example that I can offer happens to be a timely one. In 2026, we'll be celebrating the 250th anniversary of the Republic. The federal government's job, its role, the president's obligation, is to cultivate in the spirit and sensibility of Americans a properly ordered pride of place, a properly ordered patriotism, if you will. And we can do that with arts programs, the National Endowment for the Humanities, National Endowment for the Arts, which, by the way, both need serious overhauling, but I agree that they should exist. And that's the proper role for education. We also have the ability in the political sense, not a policy sense, purely political sense, for the electorate to say, we want to elect governors and members of our legislatures and members of our school boards who reflect the values that we want to see reflected in our schools. That may sound a little chaotic, but the beauty of federalism is that in that chaos, you end up having sometimes overwhelming consensus about what needs to be emphasized. And I would just trust the American people more than I trust bureaucrats in the Department of Education. I know that some of your audience on the center left may think that that's some political throwaway line, but we honest to God mean it at Heritage. If we can simply get back to that, America is going to be a much more orderly place.
Something I'm very curious about on a second totally unrelated topic level is the broader question of American conservatism itself. So Heritage's work and your project, I'm not making reference to Project 2025, but just like your project of taking an institution and moving it into the 2020s political environment, have centered on trying to, I would say, bridge the gap between the conservatism that very much was the conservatism of the 1990s when I was born, and the 2000s and the 2010s, and the fact that Donald Trump has made very clear in multiple elections that there is a different approach required by the actual base of the conservative movement, trying to forge that into a coherent project. I think it just should be noted is that President Trump has made very clear that he isn't interested in that project. I think if you said, Mr. President, Trumpism, what is it? I think he would be like not only sort of confused, but like deeply disinterested on a variety of levels. I think that's just not his. And you've spoken with him. I'm sure you will agree with that characterization. So talk about the project of Trumpism without Trump, or we're giving Trumpism, its meaning. Just talk about that itself, because I think this has been a boomlet industry, but I don't think it's led particularly anywhere useful.
I just think about historical examples, which won't be a surprise to you. I think that really gifted political leaders like Trump, like Andrew Jackson, for that matter, even Ronald Reagan, as smart as Jackson and Reagan were, and as brilliant as I know Trump to be, they're not interested in intellectual questions. Slight exception with Reagan, maybe. And it isn't that they're just so focused on the short term. It's that they measure success based on their policy programs, and to some extent, how people are in their speech are reflecting some of their own values that they articulate in their speeches. That's profoundly true for Trump. And he's just not someone who's going to spend a lot of time thinking about the conservative movement. In fact, most of the time when you would ask him that question, he would probably grouse about it. And to some extent, he would be right about it. And so that's his job. And God bless him for doing it and for leading our movement. But as I've talked to him once or twice about, it is, however, the job of a place like the Heritage Foundation, not exclusively Heritage, but perhaps especially so, for us to think about the mood of the day, to think about the policies we've been working on, and to think about where ordinary Americans are in the problems they're facing and the solutions they're sort of vaguely articulating, and to pull all that together and apply our eternal principles within the political circumstances of the day. And by the way, I think that's what my colleagues do particularly well. And so it isn't that we need President Trump to, one day say, oh man, I appreciate that, this is awesome, as much as we sort of intuit that we're on the right track. And look, there will be daylight. There's daylight between President Trump and Heritage on how far, for example, we would go in protecting the rights of the unborn. It's a very respectful difference of opinion. There are others. But the point is that one day, President Trump, hopefully many, many decades from now, will no longer be with us, in the same way that you won't live forever and I won't live forever. My colleagues at Heritage won't. The conservative movement, and God willing, America, will still be around. And that's the kind of thing that Heritage is always thinking about, is how can we be of service to any political leader of any movement, any political party, but also be thinking about how we can nurture this movement, because this movement isn't just about conservative policies like eliminating the Department of Education. At its core, it's about the permanent things. It's about principles. Of course, by definition, we don't have the power to change, nor do politicians. But it's our job to sort of be the interlocutor between the politicians and the people working on those policies and the American people.
I want to ask you about abortion politics, because I think, separate from the weight of the topic, I think this is a really fascinating thing to think about, time to think about this issue, because the message is kind of mixed. So if we had this conversation in, let's say, early 2023, we would have this straightforward narrative about abortion and pro-life politics as being this obvious loser for the right, and the 2022 backlash and the special elections in mind. When it comes to the 2024 election, Democrats overstated and were overconfident in the fact that the polls reflected that the broad center-left position is more popular, yet that didn't result in a win. And one of the things that President Trump successfully achieved during his actual race, you saw this not just in the exit polls, but in the polling, is he convinced enough voters who are quote unquote pro-choice or are like pro-life, but moderate pro-life. So they're in favor of like the longer term restrictions, but are open to conversations, especially at 6, 12, 15 weeks. He convinced them that he could be trusted to understand and read where the country's mood is. I would be curious how you, as the president of Heritage, think about this. Obviously, you have your principled stand on pro-life issues, but this is really the issue where I think the tension between principles, mandates, and frankly, the American people's beliefs, and then Trump's ability to successfully navigate those are at the core. So I'd love to just get your broad thoughts on how you think about this.
Yeah, I think about this a lot. For reasons that you do, and probably many members of your audience, wherever they may be on their position on abortion, Trump's position on this was politically brilliant. I mean, he essentially co-opted the political center on this issue at a time when every prognosticator I'm aware of said that it would be impossible for him to do so, and he was able to do so because I think what he articulated is his heartfelt position, which is that he is pro-life. He is, to use your characterization, more moderate than perhaps I and Heritage may be on it. Although, as I said, we're respectful of each other's position because we're on the same side. But then the second thing that he did, which was really important, and we have been arguing for, and we mentioned to everyone around President Trump, is if you're going to do that, at the very least, remember to present accurately that the real radicals on this issue are on the radical left. And the vice president, with all due respect, is a radical on this issue, as are most members of her political party. That is a successful twofold approach to this. But moving forward, which is really what your question is about, what's our approach at Heritage about bridging that gap, not just between us and President Trump, but across the movement and the country broadly? I will mention the following, not because it's a speech I gave, but because it's where it reflects well, I think, where the movement is. I spoke at the John Paul II Life Center in Austin, or for them a few weeks ago, and I was asked to speak about this question to an admittedly fully pro-life audience. And I said, look, for those of us who are very animated by our pro-life position, we have to be thinking and speaking more broadly about a pro-life movement that encompasses family policy. It encompasses, interestingly, an example that you mentioned earlier, Marshall, when we were talking about the Department of Education, which is very poor communities in this country. And while I can tell you firsthand, and hopefully even speaking honestly about my own beliefs, that we care, pro-lifers care as much about poor Americans and disadvantaged Americans as we do about the unborn, sometimes the way we talk doesn't necessarily get received that way. And so I think we have both a challenge and an opportunity to think about the quote unquote pro-life position in an extraordinarily broad way. And I think that's not only going to help politically, but I would also say for those of us who are motivated to our pro-life position because of our belief in the natural law and or maybe our faith, that's also appropriate. I think when we do that, and the vice president-elect is phenomenally good at speaking about it in these ways, there is real reason for cautious optimism in the pro-life movement.
Something I'd be curious about, and this relates to the abortion topic, but this is a totally different one, is the immigration side of this. So obviously, Trump very aggressively and very clearly stated that one of his day one literal priorities was going to be mass deportation. I think if we look over the 2016 to 2021 period, I think this is the most fascinating and impactful political stories because Trump comes down the escalator. He explicitly runs on building the wall. He places immigration at the center of his political story. And this is also a broader story that political parties across the broader West have had to deal with. So immigration is one of the issues of our time. However, over the course of his presidency, we see, a term which you of course know is thermostatic reaction. You see a electorate that was very much directionally in favor of the Trump position start shifting because of, let's say, bungled operations in the case of the travel ban, folks literally being in the air and then not being able to, leave the airport was just the worst headline you're looking to have in the first 5 days. And then you have child separation policy, which is seen as unnecessarily cruel. So what I'm just kind of wondering about is, as someone who is in line with President Trump when it comes to immigration, convince me, and not in the sense that you need to convince me as I'm this big person, but just convince me that we're just not going to, this is another yo-yo issue. I'm just pretty firmly convinced that if this isn't executed with, I'd say a 95%, an A level of success, we're just going to be back where we were in, let's say, 2019, in 2027, and this cycle will just continue on and on and on. I'd love to, that's just sort of my thought on it, but I'd love to hear what your thought is, considering the trajectory of the first Trump administration.
Love the question. Not that you need to hear that from me. Plus, it's your podcast. So I'm going to answer whatever question you ask, even if I don't love it. But this is a wonderful conversation, Marshall. I just love the way you frame these things because you're so well read and thoughtful. So, I'm older than you, to state the obvious, and I have spent a lot of time with yo-yos. I mean, literally playing with yo-yos. This is before cell phones and the internet. And some of the tricks you can do with yo-yos, and just indulge me as I sort of use this metaphor that you've used, is you stop the active movement of the yo-yo, and then the swinging of the yo-yo slows down. It's actually a very appropriate metaphor for this issue of the utter absence of the rule of law at the southern border. The Biden-Harris regime has been actively pushing this yo-yo, which has contributed to, conservatively, 11 million illegal aliens coming into this country. All Trump has to do is stop it. All he has to do is to close the southern border, which he, in essence, did. In fact, he achieved 95% success by the end of his first term. Our colleague at Heritage, Tom Homan, who's a great friend and with whom I have worked on border policy over the last several years, is going to stop the yo-yo. And already you are seeing a change in behavior by the cartels and all of the evil knuckleheads who are contributing to the flow of human persons across our southern border. But there's also the yo-yo of the political effect. And what happens if, for example, and I'm just trying to be very fair to your framing, in the 2026 midterms, that Democrats win the House or they take back the Senate, then you will see that yo-yo, of course, come back. It's imperative that the Trump administration move very quickly on border security, not just for the obvious, stopping the yo-yo, but also for a second dynamic that I want to talk about. And that second dynamic is a political reality that I can just tell you as leading what people say is one of the leading immigration hawk organizations on the right. We will never be party, we Heritage, we American conservatives, we will never be party to any piece of legislation that is immigration reform if first there isn't border security. And that is a very effective political position in this environment. And the Overton window, to introduce another metaphor, has really moved closer to this position. And so I wouldn't say that I'm optimistic about the following happening, but it's more likely that the following will happen. We'll see the border closed in the first year of the Trump presidency. We will see, I believe, because Speaker Johnson in particular is fantastic on this issue, that there might in fact be an opportunity to update and reform our immigration system, which, by the way, at Heritage, we want to be open and transparent and much more place a much greater emphasis on merit-based immigration, along with something that looks like the best parts of the Bracero program of the 50s and 60s. There were some very terrible 1950s, 60s eras component of that system, but the best part of that, whereby there are seasonal worker programs that benefit two nation states, likely in this case, United States and Mexico. We're big fans. But this is the point. If you start the conversation with that, border security never gets addressed. And that's why the political right has been correct since Trump came down the escalator in saying, we'll deal with you on the immigration system, but after we close the border.
So just to understand them, because I think what's interesting, because I've studied these politics, let's say McCain Kennedy in 2006, this was the early mid 2000s immigration reform bill. Like the words border security were included, but one of the reasons why conservatives were so hostile to that program, and then of course the 2013 immigration reform attempt, is they did not buy the border security as defined by that bill. So I think for honestly, the center left people in this audience who are very deeply focused on this topic, this has been the whole conversation on the center left right now, which is basically, because my conservative friends were shocked at this, but I told them this was going to happen after the election. This is the most serious conversation the center left has had about border and immigration policies. There are no Russiagate interference, get out of jail free cards here. This is very straightforward. People are reckoning with it. What is you speaking, not for conservatives, but I think as someone who accurately channels the thoughts of frankly millions of conservatives, what is your just articulated metric and standard for what? Because I think the last thing here is that I think, not to be uncharitable, I think the easy thing to say in 2006, and these aren't my politics, is basically I don't count putting up a fence in a couple of places as being border security. And I think that's the way of basically saying that's what 2006 looks like. So what's your articulation of the standard from your perspective?
For border security?
Yeah. So So if you're a center left person who's we need to find we've been spending 40 years of our politics trying to quote unquote resolve this issue ever since the Reagan consensus of the 80s broke down after the 1990s. So the way a center left person thinks about this is okay, conservatives demand border security. We need to give concessions there. I would just love to hear cleanly from you, define border security. Maybe that's a full wall across the border. How do you think about this?
Yeah, I follow you. Well, border security, bottom line, is that we have 100% operational control of every border of the country, with the obvious focus on the southern border because that's been a problem. And what that looks like is a combination. I've been down to the border many times. I'm not an expert on what I'm about to say, but I work with a lot of experts. It is a combination on that long southern border of a wall, of the usage of drones, of probably twice as many Border Patrol agents, of local law enforcement that is dispatched and properly subsidized by federal dollars to participate in that. So in other words, the mode of security is varied and even varies from quarter to quarter, and it is seasonal. But ultimately, the chief of the Border Patrol can say, I've got 100% control of that border. Now, in reality, that may mean that every year there are some few thousand people who are getting across, but compared to what's happening now, that would be a huge benefit. And look, we were really close to that in the last 3 or 4 quarters of the first Trump term. And what I would say to friends on the center left, and I really do mean that, I would love for us to be having a conversation about that and would invite that conversation with them anytime, is that whether they want to believe it or not, at Heritage, we are as interested in a transparent, humane, awesome immigration system. We might quibble on, what some of the points of emphasis are, but there's a lot more agreement there than people might think. It's just that you, whoever on the center left, will never get that political opportunity because conservatives have been burned so much on conceding on this issue of border security, which is why we're driving so hard on getting that done from both a policy and a political standpoint. If and when we get that done, and I'm very, very optimistic that we will under President Trump, then we have a tremendous opportunity to have an immigration system that I actually think will reflect at least some center-left thinking. We can leave it up to the politicians to hammer out where there might be disagreements, but I'm actually excited about that conversation because it isn't just about immigration. It's about what we value as a country and is not unrelated to the question you asked me about the role of the federal government in educating its citizenry.
So last few sections here. So a broad narrative consensus that everyone across the ideological spectrum agrees with is that the 2024 election represented the end of the Obama era, right? If we're looking back at the Oxford History of the United States, written in like 2077, I think we basically say like that first quarter of the 21st century qualifies as that. The assumptions about progress, meaning the inherent ascendance of liberalism, the Democratic Party benefiting from racial diversity, et cetera, all of those narratives have come to a close. And regardless of how President Trump's presidency goes, just the sets of issues that are defining this movement are going to be different from the, let's say, 2010s mindsets that way too many people in Washington and frankly around the country are sort of trapped in. Could you just this is hard as a historian because like I'm saying, give a historical take about now. If it's kind of separate from your political conclusions about this opportunity, could you just describe what this like post-Obama moment looks like just from a historical diagnosis perspective, as if you are writing that Oxford history of this period? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's that is challenging for a historian, but one of the things I think I was trained well in at the University of Texas is to be as objective as we can. It's ultimately impossible, but I'll do my best to leave my politics at the door when I answer this. So the following may sound like it's coming from the conservative, but in fact, the following is coming from an early American historian who's a bit of a specialist in the early national period and the revolutionary period. I think this is the refounding of the United States. By the way, I acknowledge what you said about Obama's imprint on the first quarter of the 21st century. I think that whether in the 2077 Oxford History of the United States, it's called, Trump's era or the refounding, the reason I call it the refounding is that in the place of the left's identity politics and reductionism to not just the individual, but to characteristics that are immutable, and I find as a result an affront. What we're instead appealing to now in the first part of this era is what the founders did, with all their 18th century flaws, that all men and women are created equal. And that the promise of this pluralistic society in which we have the privilege of waking each day is that we guarantee not just every other American's equal opportunity at what we have, but that each of us is willing to fight for it. And there might be a melding of one of the strands of, as you put it, the Obama era, which is that fraternity, that solidarity, if you will, with what you might consider to be a more sort of, at least Teddy Roosevelt, conservative position of sort of individual self-governance. And in a lot of ways, that's appropriate. It's historically accurate. There's a natural tension there, but the best golden eras in American history are those when we try to put those in balance, and both Republican and Democrat presidents have succeeded in doing so. You can perhaps tell in this historian's response that I'm governed more than by conservatism than by a hopefulness about America, a hopefulness about Americans, including many, if not most people on the left, and also hopefully some good humor. That if we learn how to laugh again in this country and maybe poke fun at ourselves and make politics less important to our lives and spend more time having conversations over coffee and beer with people we might vote differently from, that's a really cool America.
That history answer actually raises something I'm really fascinated by. And this is something you think about a lot at Heritage because of obviously the founding in the Reagan era is the dynamic of specific figures no longer drawing quite the same reverence or even relevancy that they once did. And obviously, and you know this, within niche conservative circles, the debate over Reagan and Reaganism and his meaning like really, really, really means something here. So I'm not trying to reduce this just to that, but like at a certain point, to give an apolitical example, at a certain point in the 20th century, it stopped being relevant to say, but Republicans, you're the party of Lincoln. Black people vote for us, right? Like that just wasn't a useful political metaphor. And something that's funny, and I appreciate you like indulging me. Part of the reason why I give these sort of long-winded questions where I explain what the 2006 McCain immigration bill looked like is there's a lot of Zoomers who listen to this show who just literally do not know anything, right? Like these things that seem obvious to me because I was in high school in the 2000s are just not on the radar at all of people. So you could contextualize this in the case of Ronald Reagan, but I'm just like fascinated, like when do figures and moments just not appear relevant? I think part of the reason why Joe Biden's like NATO pitch and his post-war order pitch, which frankly, to be frank about my politics, I agree with, it didn't resonate because I don't think anyone who is in the up for grabs young cohorts has any thoughts on the fall of the Berlin Wall. I mean, they definitely think it was like a good thing, but they're not going to have an image of Polish solidarity cracking like the Iron Curtain. It just doesn't matter anymore. So I'd just love to like hear how you think about this from your perspective as a historian.
Well, after about a generation, those kinds of references to historical figures, even major ones like Reagan and FDR, and to some extent LBJ, particularly on domestic policy, they lose their power. And I can speak on the right, for obvious reasons, and also having the privilege of leading what's called Reagan's think tank. Here at Heritage, we have people who've been here, worked here many decades. And actually participated in the Reagan Revolution. But most of our workforce would be young millennials and Zoomers. And one of those folks is my chief of staff, Wes Coopersmith. And I remember a year into my tenure here at Heritage, I'm 50 years old. I'm a son of the Reagan Revolution, first registered Republican in my family. And I just think Reagan's a hero. And so in a lot of ways, it makes sense that I lead Heritage. But I'm also tired of hearing about Reagan. And as just bear with me for a minute. As a Generation Xer, I think I've got the right to say that. I'm living the American dream, I think in large part because of Reagan's policies and Reagan's witness, Reagan's love for this country and all the people who worked with him. But I'm firmly convinced, even though I was too young to know him, that if Reagan were here today, he would tell Heritage, stop talking about me and get on with the work of America. And if Trump's the leader of the movement, then get with the leader of the movement. And if you think someone else 20 years from now needs to be revered, then go find that man or woman. There's just I guess what I'm driving at, Marshall, is there's just something simple here for the left, the right, the center, which is after about 25 or 30 years, the span of a generation, they lose their luster. It's both good and challenging that we have these figures. It's good because we really do need to have a pantheon of heroes and political figures across the political spectrum in this country. But it's also challenging in the sense that when we glom onto those people, and the political right is very guilty of this as it relates to Reagan, it keeps our thinking to be very outdated. And so for your generation, for people who might be, whose politics might be a little more politically conservative than yours, they are so tired of hearing about Reagan they know nothing about it. And so my chief of staff said, Kevin, I don't care how much you explain to me about Reagan and what he did. It doesn't matter because we're living right now and our people want to hear about what we want to do right now and in the future. And that has really stuck with me, even though in my private moments, I still love Ronald Reagan.
That is an excellent and I think self-reflective moment to end the podcast. Kevin, thank you for joining me on The Realignment.
Man, you're the best, Marshall. I really enjoyed it.